And
Right, over to you, John.
thank you, Roger. Thank you, comrades. I'm going to then try to do exactly what Roger suggested. I'm going to talk about Canada, its role, its place in the world, and I want to try and tackle this whole notion of Canada as a kind of a more liberal, tolerant, kinder, gentler kind of a society. Because it's an image that I think has been in large measure carefully cultivated. Whenever Canada is talked about, often a comparison to the United States is drawn, and the notion is that things were just done here differently, and things are done here differently, and that's something that needs to, I think, be challenged. I first arrived in Canada as a young person who had emigrated from the UK, and I was already someone who had a socialist perspective at that time, and I was used to the sort of notion that that patriotism and nationalism and such like were quite out of line with socialism if you lived in an imperialist country, and so when I arrived in Canada, I was quite astounded by, it's not as strong today, I think, but I was astounded by the amount of left nationalism that existed. I remember going to in the early days, attending a meeting at which a delegation of people who had come from Central America had come to talk about the conditions that they were facing at the hands of multinational corporations and the repression they faced and such like. And somebody actually got up and said, I can really understand how you feel, because we too in Canada live under the domination of US imperialism, and we too are colonized. And I mean, it was quite a jarring sort of experience, because to compare the situation of Canada to the situation of a Central American country seemed so preposterous that it was unimaginable. And yet that sort of sentiment did actually resonate at that time. And so, I mean, I think you have a situation where Canada emerges initially as a colonial project of the British Empire. It then finds itself sharing a border with the hegemonic world power, and those things have all tended to create this kind of a mindset of Canada being somewhat a more easygoing place, and it's been very, very carefully cultivated in a whole range of areas. I can't deal with all those areas with the time available, but often it's suggested that Canada is, unlike the United States, not an inflexible melting pot, but a diverse, multicultural society where everyone respects each other and we celebrate our differences and such like. And yet the actual reality of racism in Canada is so harsh that's just an incongruous way of presenting things. Similarly, it is suggested that Canada doesn't play the kind of role that the United States does in terms of global exploitation. And yet, in fact, most of the world's mining companies are headquartered in Canada, and Canada is unquestionably a global predator, which I'll certainly come to. It's also suggested that Canada is a peacekeeping power, but the people in Gaza at the moment would find that a rather difficult proposition to accept. So I want then to try to explore some of the ways in which reality and image are out of whack. And I think the natural place to begin is to consider how the country was established, how the state was established. Certainly, one knows of the fact that rivalry between Britain and France led to conflict, and the French colony was incorporated into the British Empire, and then later into Canada. And the Quebec question has always remained a massive issue here. But before we even get to that, the process that began was one of colonial dispossession of the Indigenous people that lived here. and that's the great difference that I had to begin to grapple with when I came here, was that this wasn't a country where feudalism was overthrown and a peasantry thrown off the land. Capitalism was established here by genocidal dispossession of the indigenous peoples, and it was indeed just as brutal as in the United States. It's often suggested otherwise, but what took place here was the complete decimation of the indigenous populations. In 1948, Newfoundland had not actually joined Canadian Confederation. It was still the Dominion of Newfoundland. So Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister, travelled to Newfoundland to discuss the terms of Newfoundland joining. And during the course of the discussions, he said something along the lines of, I've heard that you have an indigenous population here called the Beothuk. What would you say about them? And one of the Newfoundland delegation said, you don't have to worry about them, sir, because we shot them all. And that is exactly true. The Beothuk people were exterminated down to the last human being. Cross over into Nova Scotia, and a bounty was placed on the scalps of indigenous people, including children. In the Central Plains, as the indigenous people were pushed away from there, and the plains were turned into a capitalist form of agriculture, you had a situation where they had to deal with the existing indigenous population. And so the Northwest Mounted Police, which later became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, was established. And they were created as a colonial police force based on the Royal Irish Constabulary. And so their job was to force people into a reserve system where, rather like the present situation in Gaza, the calories that were allowed in were carefully regulated to keep people on the verge of starvation. If you go out to the west coast of British Columbia, very frequently when people send messages from there, they talk of British Columbia as being unceded territory, in the sense that the indigenous nations there did not sign treaties to relinquish their land. But the reason that took place is because the population had been so decimated that they didn't feel the need to do that. They didn't feel the need to make treaties with people who they'd largely exterminated. So smallpox was used as a major way of achieving that. There was an outbreak of smallpox on Vancouver Island, and indigenous people were forced to return to their homes in the inland area so as to spread the disease. It's also true that that when the South African apartheid system was being established, the South African government sent emissaries throughout the world to study different situations. And the liberal Toronto Star, which is Canada's equivalent to the Guardian, I would say, it actually it reported this, and it acknowledged this, that the emissaries of the South African government actually sent back to South Africa a report in which they said that the Canadian Indian Act and Reserve system was the best possible model they had found for the creation of an apartheid system. So that history was very much part of things, and I want to focus a little bit on the question of the treatment of the indigenous people, because it is the foundational injustice, I think, in this context. After the Canadian state was well established and the reserve system underway, there was a calculated decision made that the destruction of indigenous identity was a very, very central goal. And so what happened was that the government put in place, people may well have heard of this, there was a recent major scandal with graves found on the sites, but they established a system called the residential school system. and Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their communities and put into these places where they were subjected to, these were largely church-run facilities, and they were subjected to rampant sexual and physical abuse. But they were also punished brutally for any displays of their own culture or the speaking of their own languages. And this is a really instructive little passage that I just want to read. In 1910, a man by the name of Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the director of the Department of Indian Affairs, as it was called, he received reports from a doctor, Peter Bryce, who was explaining to him how the overcrowded conditions of the residential schools, with tuberculosis being present, were causing rampant death. And Duncan Campbell Scott responded with the following words. He said, "It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But that doesn't justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared toward a final solution of our Indian problem." So I mean, that I think people would readily agree is not really much evidence of a kinder, gentler approach. That's how things unfolded. And today, that legacy of dispossession and abandonment is still dominant. At the moment in Canada, the Indigenous population consists of about 5% of the overall population, but Indigenous people represent 30% of the prison population. And you have a situation where in this city where I live in Toronto, and I worked for years with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, if you take the homeless crisis that exists in Toronto, 2% of the population of this city consists of Indigenous people, but 33% of rough sleepers are Indigenous people. So, I mean, really, this whole process of dispossession has gone over to one of abandonment on an absolutely incredible scale. So then I think it's necessary next to look at the history of the denial of workers' rights and some of the ways in which the class struggle has played out in Canada. And I think it's important to note that, again, this sort of notion, you look at the history of the US labor movement, which is much better known, and you'll see huge confrontations, you'll see huge class battles. But I think it's important to point that the capitalists here were just as rapacious, and that the level of working class resistance has always been just as militant as in the United States. The fundamental right to unionize was achieved in a very bare form in 1873 with a very pivotal printers' strike that took place in the city of Toronto. That's when the very beginnings of any level of union rights existed. But in practice, the resort of the state to crushing workers' attempts to organize was maintained. The Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 was dealt with very brutally by the RCMP. A few years before, a strike broke out of coal miners in Vancouver Island, where workers occupied the whole of the town of Ladysmith, and a huge battle broke out. But again, the RCMP was used as a strike-breaking force and employed very brutally. The big breakthrough for trade unions in this country took place at the end of the Second World War, and again, I think it's important to note that there was not some process of give and take and accommodation. there was a determined effort to prevent workers from organising that was only overcome with the most determined struggles in the face of that state repression and employer intransigence. One of the most pivotal strikes of that period was in the city of Windsor, just across from Detroit, in southwestern Ontario, where workers went on strike against the Ford Motor Company and struck for the right to unionize. And the Ontario Provincial Police prepared an attack on the picket lines. And so, getting wind of this, the workers created a massive vehicle blockade in all of the streets. And today, the Union Local, as branches are called in Canada, the Union Local there has sort of presented this blockade as a kind of a rather cheeky, family-friendly kind of an event that was all sort of smiles, but in fact it was a very sharp struggle. Flying pickets were established to go and stop lorries, buses, and form this blockade around the plant. And there was an explosive struggle. And the Attorney General of Ontario said that insurrection has broken out in Windsor. So that led to the establishment of basic trade union rights. That was of enormous importance. But the system that was put in place, the system of industrial relations that was put in place, remains, I think, one of the harshest and most restrictive that exists in any of the major amongst the OECD countries. You have, very strict ban on actions taking place outside of the period of time when a contract is up, and workers have the right to, in a state-regulated way, go on strike. But the challenge to that is ongoing. Similarly, in the public sector, very, very late in the day, there was a dogged refusal by the Canadian state to allow levels of union organization. And it was only a 1960s wildcat strike by postal workers that turned that situation around and forced the state to recognize the right of public sector workers to organize. So the class struggle in Canada is not, in fact, a situation where everything is resolved over a nice cup of tea and everything is resolved amicably. It remains a very, very sharp struggle. And I look at the figures for levels of strike activity, and though certainly Canadian unions have been driven back, as unions have in most places in recent decades, the level of strike activity in Canada actually remains quite high relative to many other OECD countries. I also, in beginning to sort of assess Canada's role, I think it necessary to sort of challenge the concept of the Canadian state as the perennial peacekeeper, and recognize that it functions, albeit as a junior partner of the US, it functions in a highly predatory fashion. I mentioned the role of the Canadian mining companies, and they are really quite outstanding, outstandingly dreadful. If you look at the role that the mining companies play throughout the world, their record of environmental damage, their record of exploitation, their record of working with state forces in poor and oppressed countries to use extreme forms of violence to achieve their objectives is absolutely outstanding. They are probably one of the most brutal sets of interests on the world stage. Canada also, in the North American context, plays a very, very major role in terms of organizing many of the activities that are sometimes associated with the US approach to world affairs. The term "the ugly American" has been put forward, but the term "the ugly Canadian" also needs to be recognized. Chrystia Freeland, when she was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, gave a talk about the importance of recognizing Canada's interests in the Americas. And she talked about the importance of ensuring, good investment climates and such like. But her notion that Canada had some kind of right to access to those markets and to those rights to dominate those countries sounded like something out of Manifest Destiny, but it wasn't coming from Washington. It was coming from Ottawa. In terms of the undermining of the democratic rights and democratic processes of countries, Canada again plays a role up there with the United States on the world stage. Haiti is back in the news, I see today, with major areas of social dislocation and whatnot happening in Haiti. But the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Haiti was actually engineered at a meeting that took place in Ottawa. I recently saw a photograph of a demonstration in Haiti in which a man was carrying a cross, and on that cross were the flags of the United States, France, and Canada. So Canada was involved in the Honduras coup, in terms of trying to undermine the Venezuelan government. The Lima Group of nations that was established was not an American initiative. It was actually a Canadian initiative. And in Gaza, at the moment, we're seeing that role play out in exactly the same kind of a way. Of course, the coming to power of the Liberals under Justin Trudeau has added to this notion of progressive credentials. But during the Gaza situation, Canada has continued to send weapons and armaments to Israel. It was ready to unfund UNRWA as soon as the information was put out by Israel. And there's a rather nice little touch that sort of demonstrates the duplicity of the whole thing. There was reports emerging that Canada was continuing to supply armaments to Israel since October 7th, as the horror in Gaza unfolds. And so Trudeau issued a statement saying that this wasn't true because Canada was only supplying non-lethal equipment, was not supplying lethal equipment. So somebody did the job of checking through to see the kind of stuff that they were talking about. They were supplying, for example, rifle scopes to Israel. Now, I suppose it's technically true that you can't actually kill someone with a rifle scope, but once you put it on a rifle, I think it becomes pretty lethal. So Canada has continued consistently to back Israel and to back repression on exactly the same way. I think that sort of, it's my attempt initially to sort of present to you a perspective of Canada that is very different to the way it's presented in the international media, with Justin Trudeau always looking to appear very progressive and talk about inclusiveness and such like. But the reality is very, very different to that. Canada is a G7 country. It is a global exploiter. It has a very brutal history when it comes to the suppression of workers' rights, and was founded on the basis of dispossession. So that reputation of the so-called Sweden of North America is something that I think needs to be challenged and needs to be understood. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you very much, John. Very interesting and very informative, and you kept within the limits of the time very well too. So thank you very much, comrade. Right. Who is first with a question or contribution? Form an orderly queue. David.
Look, Ian, I think was one millisecond ahead of me, but
Oh,
let
sorry.
me not
Yeah, okay.
take.
I
But
won't exclude anyone.
but look, let me open up and say that you know it's a marvelous lead off, exposing a number of shall we say public illusions, you know, which the Canadian bourgeois, you know, puts out. Um, just and I'm very interested in the reference to South Africa, which, as you mentioned, John, uh, regarded the way in the treaty system or the legislation as absolutely appropriate, particularly for, I imagine, for the Bantustan, where they tried to establish pseudo states as basis for dividing the population and re-entrenching all kinds of divisions among the people. But just some points you mentioned. Your history of the unions was marvelous too, uh, reinforcing in my mind a point which, again, I'm sorry, you always make reference back to South Africa. You know, in the 1960s and 70s, we fought for trade union rights in South Africa, and it was, you know, often we were told, well, look, every state will just grant trade union rights, but there's no such state in the world which has ever granted trade union rights to workers without a huge struggle. And our rights only came through mass strikes again and again, which were all illegal, with the police intervening, trying to break it up in one way, threatening people with, you know, with machine gun fire and all the rest of it. In the end, it didn't quite turn out that way because you know, there's an ambivalence in opening up with machine guns in a city area where you could kill a lot of other people who are not working class. So, you know, that is a really powerful, you know, point that's made. Generally, it's a point maybe we could explore a little more. You've mentioned some of this, John, but Canada operates as a kind of junior partner to the states. In other words, it has the public appearance of independence, which is useful because it can take various initiatives which are not seen to have the stamp of the of the United States on it, and yet it plays that role. And in a way, it's so dependent also on the states as a kind of peripheral economy to the United States. I mean, I understand that most of the industrial development and most of the population is within something like 50 miles of the border with the United States. Now, that might be a misconception, but I think that's generally the character of the place, that any immigrants like doctors immigrating to Canada are sent north rather, you know, to try and disperse the population. But it is, in a sense, very integrally part of the United States. Just one point, and again, the word comes up of the in relation to mining. This word junior, a junior miner, or one of the smaller miners. They're seen as smaller miners and had a really terrible reputation both in Zimbabwe and in Namibia. In Tsumeb, that's Tsumeb. The one of the Canadian junior mines, so-called, was active there in expropriating, exploiting the very valuable copper mining there, plus a whole range of other metals and minerals there. And when there was a strike, which raised the question of a militant trade union there at the end, early, late in the apartheid period, and then again after independence, the Canadian company pulled out, but in its retreat, it somehow, in a very complicated way, but with all the best lawyers in the world, I'm sure, managed to expropriate the pensions of the workers and the houses of the workers too. so that the workers in Tsumeb now are living in tents and entirely, dispossessed. And of course now they've disinvested, so they can say it's nothing to do with us. But they've left an absolute, quite apart from the pollution, of the soil, the rivers, and the like. They've left devastation in its wake, the most appalling situation for Namibian workers. I hoped one of the comrades would have been here to have taken it up a little further. But look, let's exchange about that, because I think it'd be very useful to know a little more about what can you say, the imperial links, or the center of these mines and so forth, and to apportion correctly, the responsibility for these companies for the terrible mess that's been left in Namibia. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, David. I think Ian is next, and then Pam.
Hi, thank you. Just a couple of one quick contribution, and then maybe more of a question. Put the light on. Yeah, just a wee addition on, you were talking about Chrystia Friedland and foreign policy, put in the chat as well, also their position on Ukraine, with so-called World War II veteran against the Russians, was introduced to the parliament by the speaker, and they all gave him a standing ovation, and then said, in hindsight, we didn't realize that meant he was a Nazi, which of course anyone with a school history level of knowledge would have realized. And I think Justin Trudeau himself was a school teacher. Matthew also pointed out that Chrystia Friedland's got a family connection to all this, that her grandfather was who she, I think, has even said positive things about, because you can't have bad relatives and not be to blame for the sins of the father. But she has praised this guy as some kind of Ukrainian patriot, that he, as far as I'm aware, but he ran a propaganda sheet for the Nazi occupation on stolen Jewish printing presses. So yeah, there's that. I think there's quite a large Ukrainian community actually in Canada, and so Canada's taken a leading role in that, which with a liberal government and the fact that Putin's illiberalism and Russiagate and so on has created a lot of confusion in liberal circles around Ukraine war, a lot more than there is around Gaza. It's almost been seen as perhaps compatible with the kindness and inclusion facade of Trudeau's government, that he's taken a very hawkish position on Ukraine. And the other question really is about the truckers, which I think we can agree it's not a movement that we support. It was, I think, organised around the spinal column of a scab operation, United We Roll. So I'm not saying that we should have supported it, but to make those good political pushback arguments against its claim to be the real representative of the working class, which I don't think scabs can be. It's been made more difficult by the way Trudeau's treated it, that however much you don't agree with the campaign, the fact that people donating to it had their funds seized by the government and redirected to things I believe that they had no interest in donating to, and so on, and the truckers had their bank accounts frozen and all the rest of it. That this is tyrannical, even as Trudeau tries to present it as anti-fascism and so on. I'd just like to know what your take is on that, because maybe I'm going to fall out with both sides of the debate by saying I don't support the truckers, but I support the way Trudeau treated them even less, and it's made it harder for us to have that debate. But the final one, as I just saw recently as well, again on this kind of line of pretending to be all extremely socially liberal, but actually quite sinister. that they were talking about euthanasia in Canada, but that it would extend to mental health depression, and that one of the causes of that mental health depression was being poor. So they're literally presenting as left-wing the idea that the state will help you kill yourself for being poor instead of fighting for better conditions and less poverty. I don't know if you've seen about that and what you think of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah. Pam,
Okay.
then Matthew, then Finn.
I just wanted to make a few observations about. I visited Canada in 2005. I went to Vancouver. I just wanted to make some observations. Not long before I went to an exhibition at Manchester Museum about the fate of the native population, which was absolutely shocking. I actually didn't know much about it till I went to this thing. So when I went to Vancouver, that was what I was principally interested in. So you get the contrast is the way that it celebrates, that First Nations is celebrated as a symbol of Vancouver, and yet you see absolute poverty among the population. When you get to the airport, there's this great big waterfall as you walk through out into the arrivals hall, and all this sort of stuff. There's a really fantastic, the anthropological museum is unmissable. It's absolutely wonderful. And then there's a whole park full of totem poles, and you think, gosh, this is wonderful, for the First Nations. But what I also observe, I've never seen so many homeless people who were pretty much almost exclusively native First Nations people living homeless, living out of shopping trolleys, which is something I'd never seen before. And it was very, very common. They were all over the place. So this contrast between what the image that they have and the reality for lots of people was quite marked. Just one other thing I saw when I was there, I was quite lucky in that I saw the beginning of a First Nations bike ride for diabetes, because apparently diabetes is extremely common within the native population because of the way their diet and their way of living has been changed by Westerners. So that was quite interesting as well. Just the other thing, and it takes me back to Palestine. I went to visit a friend of mine who'd migrated over there 2 or 3 years before, doing very well and all the rest of it. And her attitude was towards the native population left to be a bit desired, I thought. She just said, oh, they never stop going on about this and they never stop going on about that. And they get cheap petrol and all the rest. And I think, you're living this really nice 4-bedroom house. And then these other people are living out of shopping trolleys in the street. So it was just a bit of a shock to me because, you've got this image of Canada being the sort of American Switzerland. And you get there and you can see there's an undercurrent there that is nothing of the sort. And I'm sorry I missed the beginning of John's speech. I will listen to it again later.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. And in that connection, John, it might be interesting if you say a little later about the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. I know you were you were, I think, the founder of that, or very active within it, and that's very relevant to Pam's comments. Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing here is, and it's a useful discussion, and thanks to John for his presentation, is really obviously about imperialism, the nature of it. And the fact that you do have a whole series of imperialist countries which are rapacious by their very nature and are murderous, and of course have all actually assisted in the genocide in Gaza. I mean, if you look at I mean, to take the most rank example, obviously, is the US, the hegemon, who's in 2 months, the Americans have supplied 10,000 tons of gear to the IDF by air and ship, and they basically virtually all the bombs fired at or dropped on Gaza was supplied by the US, but all the other imperialist powers are a part of that as well. You can guess there's a whole lot. When all the verbiage is, of course, worth nothing. They're really trying to cover themselves. But the thing is, obviously, what you're looking at really is a system of a hierarchy where you obviously have the US at the top, who dispose of the world and have the dominance and have the world's currency and give the ultimate orders. But the junior partners, of course, then can play their own role. and as you say, in terms of going around the world and looting what they can, So, I mean, it's how the system works. The other thing, of course, is at the moment is it's actually disintegrating. It's a very interesting point we're in. If you look at it from the point of view of analysis, is you can watch the system fall apart and therefore see some of the ways it actually works, which are usually more hidden. I think there are a few other points on that in terms of Canada. I mean, first of all, obviously, the other thing that was Canada is notorious for, of course, is accepting a whole slew of fascists after the Second World War. And there was a conscious effort by the US, the Canadians, the British, to dump useful fascists, particularly obviously Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, etc. Those from Eastern Europe in Canada, because they might come in handy, and all these people were shipped over, and of course they're all, many of them members of the SS and so on and so forth. So in fact, of course, it came in extremely handy when they've now started another war in the same area in Ukraine. And so you have, as Ian points out, the 98-year-old Waffen-SS veteran suddenly turns up and is applauded by the Canadian Parliament, which, I mean, is not an accident, and they're not that stupid. And, they knew what they're doing. But of course, in the face of the rest of the world, it becomes somewhat embarrassing, and these people are integrated. I mean, the point was, and as actually a point being made, of course, that the Ukrainian community before that in Canada were reasonably left-wing, actually, many of them socialists. And of course, once they'd shipped in all these old fascists, of course, they could change the whole thing round. And then you wind up in a situation where you have, the principal ministers of the government, like Chrystia Freeland's, actually comes from that heritage of Ukrainian fascism. That's the politics of the country, is what you might expect. The other thing I think also is in terms of the trade unions in Canada, which are quite strange. I mean, obviously, what you've got is a combination between local unions and US unions, and of course, particularly obviously in auto. I mean, the original union, of course, is the UAW, which, of course, in terms, is part of the great CIO explosion in the 30s, and therefore, it's a progressive thing. The fact that, as you say, in Windsor is fought through, against the cops in Dearborn in River Rouge. They actually physically kicked, over the river. They actually physically kicked the Ford's goons out of the plant in order that they could get the union in. I mean, this, as you say, it's done as organised, violence by the workers against the bosses and the police, which is entirely, something we should be in favour of. But of course, then what we wind up now with is a situation where the US unions are integrated, clearly integrated into the system of US capitalism, and the union bureaucracy is a method of obstruction. Of course, the thing is that obviously in Canada there's a split between the UAW and its Canadian arm, which became the CAW, the Canadian Auto Workers Union, basically under the initial idea that they weren't going to allow the sort of concessions that happened in south of the border. And they were going to keep trying to get things out of the big three in particular. But of course, because obviously the whole question of, can unions actually operate across borders? If they can, that is progressive. If they're split by borders, of course, it's not so. And so you wind up a situation, obviously under the current circumstances where you have Unifor, which is the inheritor of the CAW, and the UAW south of the border effectively running this thing, where they balance off concessions, who can give the most in order to keep the bosses happy, and of course the bosses, they play one side against the other. So there's that question. There's obviously the public sector question. Then you've got questions, things like the United Steelworkers, which of course plays a major role in Canadian mining. It'd be useful to have if you could say something about the operation of the unions in Canada. Thanks.
Yep, thanks, Matthew. Finn.
Comrades, I want to thank John for a very informative and interesting contribution. But I want to raise a couple of questions which I'd like to hear some discussion on. Firstly, the role of the New Democratic Party in Canada. It was formed, I think, in 1961 by a discussion between the Labour Congress and the cooperative movement in Canada, which is very like what happened actually with the British Labour Party. In its founding period, it did bring together the co-op and the trade union movement. And I'd like to hear the experiences of the New Democratic Party in Canada. Now, when, as a network of workers' organisations, would like to establish contacts with labour activists in the trade unions and the various social democratic and other organisations in Canada. So the information which I'm looking for is about to what extent is there a left development within the New Democratic Party? I understand they were in power in Alberta, which a state I visited a few times. Is there a left developing? And what's the perspective for the New Democratic Party or an alternative workers' party should such emerge? Another issue which have some things I observed during my few visits to Canada, I noticed for example, in Calgary, Alberta, people of the First Nations begging on the streets, very obvious poverty amongst the people of the First Nations. I visited the reservations in that region, which are they're given some kind of autonomy to run themselves as a small little nation, within the Canadian Federation. But in reality, they're all just doing crafts and supportive industries, which are then sold as trinkets in the shops, in the major places and so on. Something else which I'd like to hear a bit about is the ethnic divisions that exist in Canada, and to what extent does that play a role in politics? For example, there's a very large Chinese population which came originally to build the railway, the Trans-Canadian Railway across to the west coast. And a lot of them then lived in Vancouver, which was also in at one stage. Is that an issue? Is there an ethnic division being exploited, or can it be exploited? I noticed also there's a very large Sikh population, particularly in Alberta and in Calgary. I went to one of their festivals once when I was there, and there's a huge number of people. When we were approaching the venue where the festival was on, there were massive numbers of Indian people on the streets and in the thoroughfares approaching the festival. So there's obviously a very big population there. And again, what I'm really interested in, is there a danger or a possibility or an exploitation of ethnic division? I'd like to know also, how are people of these ethnic origins involved in the socialist struggle, the trade union struggle, the various community movements that begin to evolve? So I know the issues I've raised are quite wide. They're issues I'd like to hear a bit of discussion about and a bit of information about, because with particular reference to when our perspective is to establish contact with labour activists in the various countries, and to give us some understanding of what workers are doing in a quite complex society such as Canada is, with a view to hearing more discussions that can influence us in our understanding. And similarly, we could influence from our experiences in the various countries in which we are active ourselves. So thanks again, John, for a very interesting and informative opening contribution. And I'd like to hear more discussion of the issues I've raised just now.
Okay, thanks, Finn. There's nobody else with their hands up at the moment. Maybe, John, if you'd like to come back on some of those questions, and then we'll throw it open again.
Yeah, thanks very much, Roger. You've sort of given me enough to go through the next 10 sessions, I think, but I'll try to be I'll try to pick out the essentials to the best of my ability. The first thing that came up that I thought was really significant was this concept of Canada as a junior partner of the United States. I mean, in one sense, that's completely true. I mean, it's true probably of the other Western imperialist powers as well. I mean, I don't think Britain is going to be too anxious to cross swords with the vital interests of the United States. But given the proximity that exists, and given the interpenetration that takes place in all kinds of ways, there's a particular quality to that. But it's really, really important, I think. I mean, so often you'll see people put out stuff about, you know, Canada is just acting as the US puppet and blah, blah, blah. That's not entirely true. Canada is, in its own right, an imperialist power, and it has its own distinct interests. And I think that's something that needs to be appreciated. Now, it's certainly true that Canada wouldn't want to clash with the United States at the Security Council or something or whatever. But nonetheless, it's not. It's Canadian mining interests, for example, have driven the agenda of Canadian foreign policy to a huge degree. So that distinct feature has to be understood. And when it comes to the mining companies, again, nothing junior about the role that Canada plays. Like 40% of the world's mining capital is raised on the Toronto Stock Exchange. 70% of the world's mining companies are headquartered in Canada. In that particular area, Canada is a cutting-edge global predator, and its companies, Barrick Gold Resources, Hudbay, and all the rest of them are in the forefront of global exploitation. So that's a change that's taken place in the decades that I've lived in Canada, and it's really, I think, worth noting. And that's true in other areas too. The Rana Plaza disaster that happened in Bangladesh when all those garment workers were killed, they were carrying out a rush order for Loblaws Joe Fresh, which is the Canadian portion of the Western family. And in fact, Rana Plaza survivors tried to take those companies to court. And the Canadian courts ruled that this was something that happened in Bangladesh, so they didn't have any role to play, and people didn't get any support. But that's the significance of what's taking place there. On the question of the Ukrainian community, I thought that was a really important consideration. Yes, I mean, the Nazi that appeared in the Canadian Parliament, Chrystia Freeland and all those other people knew exactly what was going on. There is a big link to the Ukrainian right, and there is a very strong right-wing current in the Ukrainian community here. But the point is also well taken, and it's a very important one, to understand that there is a radical left tradition that's very, very strong in the Ukrainian community here as well, a very large community. When the Winnipeg General Strike happened in 1919, the Ukrainian Labour Temple was the place where the printing press for the strike was headquartered, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police came in and smashed the place up. And to this day, that Labour Temple remains a central place for the left in not just Winnipeg, but across Canada. So there's a very strong left tradition. The truckers, the so-called truckers convoy, the Freedom Convoy, that was raised, and I think that's been debated a lot and discussed a lot. But I mean, they used, like fascist groups everywhere, they become very, very good at finding the issues through which they can bring around them a larger periphery of people who are reactionary but not yet fascists. And the use of the grievances around the public health systems during the pandemic was the particular tactic they used there. But the Freedom Convoy was an incredibly dangerous development. It was the largest mobilization organized by the far right in Canada since the 1930s. And it struck a chord. They mobilized a very, very, very impressive action. It was actually a group of fascists from the western part of Canada who played the lead organizing role. One of them, by the name of King, he likes to put out videos. And you can see one video he puts out where he says that, you know, the white race in Canada is under attack, and if we don't fight back, the official languages of the country will become Mandarin and Hebrew. So it gives you sort of a sense of the kind of people that were organizing that little exercise. But the Freedom Convoy organized a very impressive, a very major, and a very disruptive mobilization that was enormously scary. I totally agree with the point, however, that the use of the so-called Emergencies Act that the Trudeau government used to finally contain it was a very, very dangerous development that we don't have any interest in supporting. Legislation like that is going to be used primarily against us and not against the fascists, and that's the reality of that situation, I think. So I support completely the point that was made there. The question was also raised about US-based unions. They're often referred to as international unions, but that's a little patronizing, perhaps. And domestic Canadian unions. There's been various currents at work there, but I think it important to note that at the time when the split in the 1980s occurred between the Canadian section of the UAW, the United Auto Workers, and the Canadian section and the rest of the union, the disagreement was unquestionably a far more militant approach being taken by the Canadian section. They did not want to make concessions, and they went their own way, and they separated, and they did so around a more militant program, and that's unquestionably true. I think today that concessions battle has been largely lost, and I don't think you could say that there is this rift between a more militant Canadian-based approach and a Canadian approach. I don't think that's the reality that exists today, and there's long been lots and lots of debates in Canada about the advantages of working with workers in the United States as opposed to Canadian-built organizations. With regards to the NDP, I mean, I don't think the NDP, if I look at the present federal leader of the NDP, is a man by the name of Jagmeet Singh, who I actually used to know at one point rather well. He was a very militant organizer in the Sikh community to the west of Toronto. He's changed somewhat significantly over the years. But I mean, if I looked at what has happened with the Starmer restoration, I would say that, you have a far more egregious right-wing current taking place at the moment. But fundamentally, the notion of looking for a place within an austerity consensus, I think has taken in the NDP in the same way as it has many social democratic parties throughout the world. One of them rather demagogically, I remember giving a speech in which he said, "We're not advocating the third way, but a Canadian way." But the essential accommodation takes place. But there's one important, I think, distinction about Canada that's really significant, and that is the existence of a robust centre-right Liberal Party. It didn't go into the Liberal Party didn't go into a state of faded glory in the 20th century the way it did in Britain. The Liberal Party remains a very, very strong, dominant formation, which really means that when the NDP tries to embrace the political centre, it really becomes a practice of selling out when nobody's buying, because that space is already occupied by a thriving and significant Liberal Party. There are left currents that are emerging within the NDP, and the NDP has always been a battleground in that there are left activists. I don't think there's anything comparable to the kind of to Corbyn. I don't think there's any figure that would be comparable to Corbyn, but there are definite strong left currents. The NDP does hold power at the moment, no longer in Alberta. They've been replaced by a Conservative, but they do hold power in British Columbia, and they've played an absolutely dreadful role. They've been totally subservient to extractive capital, to resource-based capital, to oil companies, to loggers, to all the sort of the class enemies, and they've played a really, really terrible role. A left environmental activist ran recently for the leadership of that party and was bureaucratically suppressed. So they're very, very, very right-wing formation on the West Coast. Very interesting development here in Ontario. Just down the road from Toronto is the city of Hamilton, which is really Canada's Sheffield, sort of a deindustrialized steel town, very major working class center. They are a young woman of Somali background, disabled woman, wheelchair user, very active in disabled rights issues and such like. She got elected as what's called here an MPP, a member of the provincial parliament, the Ontario legislature, and she came out in support of the Palestinian struggle, and was actually. She actually has been censored by the legislature, and she's not allowed to speak in the legislature, but she remains an MPP. But she was shamefully booted out by the NDP caucus, as they say, the caucus at the Ontario legislature. So she currently is an independent, and so in terms of the possibilities of sort of left formations, I would say the Sarah Jammer development is really, really a significant one. She's got a real basis of support. The Hamilton and District Labour Council, the Trades Council, has actually come out in support of her and is actually putting resources into backing her re-election campaign, whether she's brought back into the caucus or whether she runs as an independent. So that's really, really, really significant. The final thing I'll try to deal with, I'll hold off on any history of OCAP. I think it's a bit too ambitious at the moment, but I did want to deal with this question of multiculturalism that was raised. The official policy, I mean, first of all, Canada and the city where I live, Toronto especially, is a very diverse place. The Guardian reported a little while ago that Toronto had to be considered the most multicultural city on earth. There is huge diverse population here, but there is a very specific mechanism of control that's brokered mainly through the Liberal Party, and it's called multiculturalism. So the whole idea is that immigrant communities and racialized communities are kept in line through a process whereby officially appointed gatekeepers that represent that community are established, and so you have this sort of whole system of trying to control the discontent and the organizing that takes place within those communities. There's certainly high levels of racism, but there's also a great deal of unified action that takes place. But that sort of controlling mechanism of having sort of figures close to the Liberal Party who are playing the sort of the lead role in those communities is such a dampening impact. And we got some evidence of that in the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, where we were constantly being blocked in terms of trying to work with communities by the official gatekeepers of multiculturalism. The Somali community in this city is especially impoverished, but the mechanisms of control seem to be very, 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 very weak. And we found we were able to do an incredible amount of very good organizing and appoint and create Somali organizers and begin to do a huge amount of organizing once we were free of those sort of official mechanisms of control. So yes, again, I mean, the line that's always put forward is that Justin Trudeau get his handkerchief out and cry about this, but he would talk about how Canada is not like the United States. Here we celebrate differences and all the rest of it, but those differences don't play out exactly the way that they suggest.
Yeah, thank you, John. Anybody else now? I think, Sadar, did you have your hand up at one point? Or any comrades want to come in? It's really interesting what you're saying, John.
Yes, comrade. Good
Yeah,
afternoon.
thank you.
It's evening, Nigeria.
Yes.
I hope comrades are hearing me. Well, hello, comrades.
Yep. Carry on.
Hello.
We can hear you, comrade.
Okay, comrades. Yes, it's an interesting discussion discussing Canada. Because though Canada is a capitalist country, but in Nigeria, Canada is like an heaven, like a heaven to ordinary people who could not avoid $1 per day. That is the level of poverty in Nigeria. And that explains why there are high demands of young people, ordinary people seeing the United States, the United Kingdom, of the Schengen countries in Europe as a solution, migrating as their problem, as the solution to the economic problem. But the analysis by Comrade John, the last 1 hour, has refuted the crisis of capitalism in developed countries like it is in Canada. For instance, if you check about the migration from Nigeria to Canada, it's over 1,000 in a year. I may not completely be right, but I know that if you park a dead ship on the sea in Nigeria, and you say this ship is going to Canada or is going to the UK, you will see councillors, elected councillors in Nigeria. You will see chiefs, kings, directors. We enter the ship so as to leave Nigeria to Canada. But because of our own experience as a comrade, I've been to Germany, I've been to Spain, in Barcelona, Berlin in Germany. I've seen that capitalism remain unresolved. The contradictions of capitalism, even in developed countries like Canada, like what the comrade has explained, the crisis of immigration between Africa in Europe, Africa in America, Africa in Latin America, has shown the deep crisis of
Comrade, I don't know if are you cut off, comrade?
I think he's lost his connection, Roger.
Okay. Okay, well, look, we may come back to you. Ian, and then David, and then Finn. But as soon as we get the connection back with Sarar, we'll return to him.
Just a couple of quick questions this time. I saw a webinar yesterday. I caught the second half after going on the Palestine demo about the two Michaels case that I wasn't aware of before, but to do with situation between Canada and China, the arrest of the Huawei executive, Trudeau's accusation that was a tit for tat, and now one of them has accused the other of having been connected to Canadian intelligence as well. So just if you've got any thoughts on that in terms of Canada's imperial role, we've talked about it in other contexts with Ukraine and Palestine, but also with the big conflict between America and the West, of which Canada's part, and China. And then the other one was just something you said in your response, made me think of a follow-up question. In terms of the Liberal Party, is one of the big differences in politics is that the Liberal Party, going back presumably to the British Liberal Party, as was in the 19th century, since it's an Anglophone country, not just Anglophone, but Commonwealth country, you know what I mean, that it's persisted, and the more Labour type NDP is a third party. I loved your comment about they're selling out but nobody's buying. But I was just wondering if that's basically the same situation as south of the border with the US Democrats as a non-Labour based alternative to the outright conservatives, or if it's maybe even caused by the relationship with the USA and that being the structure down there, or if it's a totally different thing, since obviously the US didn't come out of the Commonwealth in that way. And there was even a switcheroo at one point where the Democrats were the more right-wing of the two parties, whereas I don't think that happened in Canada. But yeah, just is it another example of the American influence or something more native, this situation with the Liberals?
Thank you. David.
Yeah, thank you. Just a brief point, John. You know, I'm living in Rhode Island, which is was the center for the Industrial Revolution, at least the textile part of it. And what's interesting in going through the various museums here, and even in talking to people in the pubs, is that just about every one of them has a French surname. It appears that American capitalism, as it took off in the Northeast here, was based on English capitalists and French workers. It's extraordinary. There's hardly a non-French name in all the registers of workers in the 19th century textile industry. And, you know, the inhabitants, you know, are still around here. But, and the church made a huge effort to try and get, you know, the French Canadians back. But a large number of the French here, let's say you know, the descendants are Acadian, and I don't know how I got married to one because they hate the English, but you know, that is another tradition. So at one time there was a huge interaction between, let's say, Northeast America and Arcadia. I mean, as the English are very good at renaming Newfoundland, it originally was New Canada and the like, and the Quebecois used to and fro, but now, you know, the America's a pole of attraction, it seems, for Canadians, and most have actually moved down here as part quite a major section of the working class, but are not organized in any way separately politically. They just blend in and accept other leaders.
Yeah, thank you, David. Finn, and I see that Kieran, I don't know if your putting your hand up facility is not there, but you're next, okay?
Comrades, just a point I forgot to mention. It's about there's a close link in Canada between the environmental movement and left activism. And I want to make a particular reference to the question of the tar sands, exploitation of tar sands. We were told that was going to make Canada the second largest oil producer in the world, the exploitation of tar sands by 2050. And a mass movement developed in opposition to the exploitation and the damages being caused, polluting the air and poisoning the water by extracting oil from the what were called tar sands. Now that environmental movement, I presume, still exists. I'm not sure what the perspective is now for the left, but there was quite a strong community and mass involvement in that. The second point, maybe another comment. When John was speaking on the second occasion, he referred to the growth of left groups within the NDP, the National or the New Democratic Party. Now that's probably a different experience from what's happening in Britain. But if there are still left groups developing and growing and having influence, as John seemed to refer there in his second contribution, have we got any knowledge of who they are, where they're coming from, what their perspective is, and where their influence is growing? Which state would they be strongest in, for example? So in terms of activism, I'd be interested to hear about these left groups that John referred to that are growing around the New Democratic Party, what their influence is. And just an allied kind of issue is there a demand in the, as John explained, the right-wing turn that the New Democratic Party have made, making the comparison with Starmer's Britain? Is there a demand for another or a new Labour Party Now, when the NDP was formed in 1961, it was a very progressive development, bringing the Labour Congress together, as I said, with the co-ops. But is there now, is the question been raised at all, is the need for a new Workers' Party or a mass socialist party?
Yep, thanks. Yep, Kieran. Oh. Well, while we're waiting for Kieran, anybody else?
Roger, I'm here now.
Kieran, there you are. Okay.
Yeah. Just a short, maybe 2 comments and 2 questions. It's a very interesting lead off, John, so thanks very much. I've known your name for a long time, the Ontario Coalition. I've been aware of for a long time, and it is of interest, so it's good to hear from you directly. So my first question, it just is about your, I guess, your fundamental point about the nature of Canadian capitalism and Canada as being an imperialist power, a junior imperialist power. And I accept all the points you made, but when you started your contribution, I guess I did expect something a little bit different. And so I'm just telling you that I've been proven wrong, I guess, because I thought it would be accurate to say that it wasn't just that Canada is a secondary imperialist power and America is a primary imperialist power, and there's certain relationships there. I would have thought that there's maybe a kernel of truth in the left nationalist argument that Canada was exploited in a more direct sense by US imperialism, perhaps historically, perhaps not in the modern era, but there was something in that, and that has helped to shape Canada as it is as a modern nation. And maybe that sense, if it still lingers, of a left nationalism has some social, has some basis in fact, in economic fact. But that would be my impression up until today. Perhaps I picked up on that left nationalism decades ago and thought there was something to it, but perhaps not. But my second question is, and well, it's not really a question, it's just to ask if you take some time to comment on the question of Quebec and the Quebec national question, because it's a very interesting lead off, and obviously you've limited time in any lead off, but you haven't dealt with what I would have thought would be one of the most crucial features of Canada. And if any of us wish to understand Canada as a nation, in inverted commas, what about the question of the Quebec nation and where the national question is today? So I'm old enough to remember the kind of, if you like, the high points of Quebecois nationalism in just about the early 1970s. There was a huge upsurge in the Quebec national movement, and then 2 decades later, 25 years later, there was the referendum, which was lost. My memory or reading of the movement in the 1960s and the early 1970s, it was more than most nationalist movements in the advanced capitalist nations, a workers' movement. Nationalism, Quebec nationalism equated with the working class. And whereas in many nations, including in Ireland, nationalism is often the petty bourgeois movement in the strict Marxist sense, or the bourgeois movement. In Quebec, it is very much identified with the working class. And there were clashes, if you like, between the Anglophone working class and the French-speaking working class, not in the direct sense, I mean, but in the ideological sense. It'd be interesting to hear more about that, about the referendum 25 years ago, which went down to defeat. I haven't heard any commentary in recent years about a possible second referendum. I assume the tide has gone out for Quebec nationalism for now. But is there any possibility that that'll come to the fore again in a more, fulsome way and perhaps lead to a second referendum? I don't know. I feel I should have done more homework for this, John, because it's a very interesting lead off, and I used to know more about the Quebec national question, but I needed to do some revision, and I haven't done it. So I could have asked better questions, perhaps, or more pointed questions. But thank you anyhow for a very, very interesting contribution.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other comrades who want to speak? Finn, I think, is that a legacy hand up?
Oh, sorry, Roger.
Okay, yeah. I assumed.
Legacy.
Any other comrades? Okay, John, do you want to come back?
Yes. Well, first of all, China, the 2 Michaels comes up. Yes, in fact, Canada is playing a very provocative role in terms of the whole global rivalry situation with China. And it's necessary, first of all, to stress that the role that anti-Chinese racism has played in the history of Canada is a dramatic one. Chinese labor was brought into Canada to build the railroads under the most deplorable conditions, and then those people were just abandoned. And for a long period of time, the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented Chinese people from coming to this country. So a deep, long, ugly history, and that is being significantly revived. And I don't think that's a hyperbolic thing to say. In terms of participating in the ramping up of confrontation, Canadian warships have gone through the Taiwan Strait, as have US ships. I mean, that's part of the process. But the sort of the idea to build up a kind of a pre-war fever kind of a mentality has really been taken to considerable lengths, with all this hype about Chinese spy balloons flying over Canada, and one particular news network, Global TV, has spearheaded this whole campaign to suggest that members of parliament and of the provincial legislators of Chinese background are part of a paid fifth column, representing the interests of the Chinese governments, and MPs have had to step down from their participation, and all kinds of very, very ugly stuff going on. So that's a really, really serious consideration. The question that was asked about the liberals here and the Democrats in the United States. Well, I mean, in the sense that they are both sort of center-right, more liberal parties that counterpose themselves to a more right-wing alternative, because there's a Conservative Party here that is virulently right-wing at this particular point, headed up by a man, Pierre Poilievre, who his coronation represented a triumph for the right. So a very, very hard right Conservative government, so a Conservative Party. So yes, the history of the Liberals is absolutely rooted in British politics. It's an offshoot of the British Liberal Party, and it's just, I mean, it's a thing that you really have to. One of the key differences that has to be borne in mind in terms of the politics here, that you have a situation where first and second spot are still fought out for between a Conservative and a Liberal Party, and the NDP, while in some provinces it has a history of governing, the NDP has never been able to form a government at the federal level. It's always been consistently blocked. So that's a very, very striking and important difference. A question was asked about, which I don't think I can adequately at all answer, interconnection between Quebecois and Acadian people and the northeastern United States. I don't think I have much knowledge that I could contribute to that, but I've unquestionably in trips to Quebec have seen evidence of that interconnection that takes place. The question was asked about tar sands, and many of these are questions that would be worthy of a session of themselves, so I'm trying to just abridge things here. Yes, the tar sands is an absolutely appalling development. In terms of degradation of the environment in that part of Canada, it's appalling what's happening. It also is incredibly destructive for the largely Indigenous communities that live in that area. But it has to be stressed that the development of the tar sands and the pipeline projects and all the rest of it are one of the fundamental strategic imperatives of Canadian capitalism at the moment. The notion of oil and gas exports to the Pacific Rim is central to the whole strategies that they are developing. Justin Trudeau gave this talk here in, I think it was Dallas, anyway, to oil barons in the United States, where he talked about the incredible reserves that Canada has through this dirty oil, and how important it was, and how no country would leave it in the ground. So, I mean, Canada is one of the countries that is at the forefront of environmental degradation at the moment, and the pursuit of oil and gas strategies. And there is considerable resistance to that. There is indeed a strong environmental movement that continues to organize. And it must also be remembered that the taking of those pipelines through Indigenous territory is an absolutely major question in the life of this country. In 2020, the resistance of the Wet'suwet'en people in British Columbia led to solidarity actions being organized all across the country, where road and rail connections were shut down by mobilizations, where ships were backed up in the Pacific outside of Vancouver, where freight was not moving across the country. I mean, there's dramatic, that sort of link between Indigenous rights and environmental protection is a very, very explosive question in terms of social struggles within Canada. I must say, perhaps I may have appeared to overstate my confidence in sort of growing left formations within the NDP. I don't think it is actually at that point this strong. There's an NDP socialist caucus. There's various kinds of initiatives, and there are some individual legislators who are identified as being relatively left wing. But there isn't. I don't think it'd be fair to say any major groundswell on the left within the NDP at the moment. But I mean, I don't think it would be very. I think it would be a big mistake to write off the possibility of something dramatic happening. I think that's always a possibility. I strongly suspect that people wouldn't have predicted the Corbyn development happening, and the possibility of something like that happening and expressing the indignation and anger that's there, expressing itself within the NDP, is something that I think has to be reckoned with as a possibility. There is always demands for the formation of alternatives, and that's something that people pay a lot of attention to. The development I mentioned of Sarah Jammer, for example, in Hamilton, is is rich with possibilities. My own view is that that sort of initiative within a social democratic party is more likely to come in a situation where you have a much more ascendant level of social struggle in the trade unions and in the social movements. So I think there's a sort of a link between those possibilities and the level of social struggle that's taking place, which is certainly on the upsurge at the moment. The question was raised, of course, of Quebec, and I sort of didn't place much emphasis on it when I was speaking, not because it isn't a massive question. That's entirely true. I was just, in terms of an initial presentation, it's such a big question. I pushed it to one side because I was very confident it was going to get brought up. So, I mean, I'm not based in Quebec, and I don't claim to speak for movements in Quebec or have, any outstanding knowledge, but it is, of course, central to the life of the country. There exists a Quebecois nation. There's absolutely no question that's the case, with all of the normal rights of self-determination that applied there. The Canadian state was created through suppressing that right, and has been maintained by suppressing that right. There's been some very, very interesting developments in Quebec in the years that I've lived in Canada. I don't like to go into sort of anecdotes here, but the week I arrived in Canada, so this is, I have to confess, it was 1976. The week I arrived in Canada, I was working at a little machine shop in London, Ontario, and I get the boss asked me if I would go down to Montreal to deliver some parts to the chief engineer's office at the Montreal airport. And so I go down there, and the chief engineer is Anglophone. And there's a couple of people who are obviously Francophone in the office, but all of the business of the office is conducted in English. And just by chance at that moment, the phone rings, and this character picks up the phone. He goes, we, and he was obviously really miffed that somebody would have the impertinence to speak to him in French. And he hung up the phone. And I sort of realized afterwards, when I thought about it in years to come, that I was actually watching a society that was in a dramatic process of transition. Because I suspect a couple of years before that, anybody who phoned him up and spoke to him in French would be immediately told to speak English and reprimanded. But he didn't feel that confident, but he was still, his Anglophone empire was still pretty intact. Today, if you went back to that office, everything would be in French. There have been very, very major changes that have taken place in Quebec society. In the early part of the going into the 70s, you had vast national grievances, language grievances, but economic grievances. There was a huge pay gap between Francophone and Anglophone workers. The professional middle classes were dominated by Anglophones. Capital was Anglophone. So there was clearly very, very obvious oppression taking place. And Canadian Quebec nationalism was extremely radical. There were all kinds of different currents, but they were very strong left currents, and absolutely correct. They were linked to trade union struggles. In the early 1970s, massive wave of trade union struggle broke out in Quebec that was incredibly radical, with probably some of the largest mobilizations in North America and some of the most radical. One comrade I was speaking to said that the small Quebec town he was living in, the red flag was flying over the police station, the town hall for 2 weeks. I mean, there was absolute, an absolute upsurge taking place in Quebec at that time. And the Quebec movement had links to the Black Panthers, it had links to the Algerians. I mean, it was very, very radical. Today, the level of economic grievance based on Anglophone, Francophone has been, I think, largely eradicated. And what has also taken place is that you have an advent of the transfer of leadership in the national movement, dominant leadership. There's still a Quebec solidaire that is left and nationalist that holds some number of seats, but the dominant forces within Quebec are right-wing led and extremely conservative. The present nationalist leadership in Quebec is a horribly right-wing, viciously Islamophobic, and just a dreadful formation. So those developments have all taken place. I fundamentally, absolutely, there is a Quebecois nation with the right to self-determination, but the complexities of Quebec nationalism are considerable at this particular point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, John. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I think you have a lot to offer in other discussions. Do come, as you know, we meet every week, and you'd be very welcome to participate. Right, comrades, next week is a very important meeting. And I think it'd be better if I leave it to David to give more details.
Yes, comrades. If you're following our WIN Facebook, you'll see we already have a notice up for the meeting. It'll take the form of a particular rally style of meeting on the coming Sunday. All around the question of solidarity with Palestine and highlighting the way in which the labor movement, which had been mobilized against apartheid, can be mobilized, in favor of the Palestinian people, and an outrage and focused attention and solidarity against those who are suffering the most terrible genocide. And, this is being organized together with Jabu Nala, who's in and out of our discussions at times, but has had a great leadership role in the Oxford Town Council. And we are looking forward to being able to mobilize councillors throughout Britain and activists elsewhere who have resigned from the Labour Party in outrage against the policy that they have towards Israel, and the lack of solidarity and a complete contempt for those who are currently, being slaughtered in Gaza. So, comrades, you'll see that there's quite a lineup. I've put out a link right now, if you would like to follow that up. We'll be obviously notifying you again by email, but we'll be putting up the poster in South Africa, in the United States, and throughout Europe and elsewhere. And we do expect to have quite a very vibrant and activist discussion group around the Palestinian question in the coming Sunday.
All right, thank you. Thanks, David. So I really appeal to comrades to come and to encourage others to come. I think it will be quite a landmark meeting. So, right, unless anybody has any other announcements. Right, I'll say goodbye and thank you for coming, and see you all next week. Bye, comrades.
Bye.